Hi, welcome to YouTube Live. My name is Dawn Wiggins. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist and your life and relationship strategist. Lately, we've been doing an Ask Dawn Anything series where each week we take on a tough topic, and this week's topic is addiction. I'm really excited to have you here if you're streaming live with us and you're going to join us in the chat. And if you're watching the video after the fact, thank you so much for taking the time. Addiction is a really complicated and complex topic that affects not only the person who's addicted, but the loved ones that are part of their lives. Imagine if you're addicted, that you're experiencing some combination of chronic emotional, psychological, or physical pain and have a diagnosis that is considered a disease up to and including through the Surgeon General's announcement last month that it is a chronic brain disease, and you have limited support from your family and from society because of the stigma that still surrounds addiction. The prognosis is fatal, and you believe, if you're not in recovery, that the only solution to this pain that you chronically suffer is to use your substance of choice. It's an incredibly heavy diagnosis to bear, and for all of those of you out there who have either suffered or are suffering from addiction or are the loved one of an addict, my heart goes out to you. I have experience with addiction both personally and professionally. I've experienced it in my personal and family relationships, as well as spending about a decade working in the field, working with patients and families that are struggling with addiction. So this is certainly a topic that is close to my heart and something that I enjoy speaking about. I think that it's really important to break through the stigma. Imagine if you received a dangerous diagnosis like cancer. That kind of diagnosis is heart-wrenching, of course, but comes with a lot of support typically from your loved ones and from society. This is a very different type of diagnosis, and most family members and society do not know how to approach it. And so let's do whatever we can today to break through that and to provide some support to those struggling with addiction today. So thanks for joining, and let's jump into the questions. So let me check the chat box. I have two questions so far. What types of addictions are there? And is there a proper way to approach helping someone with addiction? So let's take the first one. What types of addictions are there? Well, there are a couple of types of addictions that we want to discuss. One would be a chemical dependency, meaning it's where you become physically dependent on a substance such as alcohol, nicotine, tobacco, heroin, cannabis, you name it, and you develop an addiction to a substance. That doesn't just happen with the dependency that your body becomes used to, like where if you take too many benzodiazepines or too many opiates or drink too much for too long, that your body becomes physically dependent on it and you experience physical withdrawals. There is also a brain chemistry portion that goes with that addiction. So dependency on a chemical substance isn't just about the body's dependence on it. There is also a brain component to it. And then there's a second type of addiction, which we call a process addiction. And that can be an addiction to the process being food or gambling or something related to sex. And process addictions are still kind of highly debated in the field. There are some people believe that process addictions are absolutely addictions, and there's some people that believe that it is on a different spectrum and they're not necessarily addiction related. But it's generally accepted that process addictions are real, and you can experience withdrawal symptoms if you stop one. So for instance, if you have been gambling habitually, chronically, and an addictive capacity, and you stop gambling cold turkey, you are likely to experience withdrawal symptoms, meaning agitation, emotional distress, restlessness, perhaps sleeplessness, racing thoughts. And that's because the process that you've been using to numb the pain, and that's ultimately what addicts are doing. They're numbing, they're emotional, psychological, or physical pain with either a substance or a process. And when you stop using whatever it is that you're using to numb, all of that distress surfaces. And so there are withdrawal symptoms with both process addictions and chemical addictions. What is the proper way to approach helping someone with addiction? I wish there was an easy answer. So there's a lot of components that go into helping someone with addiction. Number one, we have to understand that each person that suffers from addiction, their experience is slightly different from the next because their brain chemistry is different, their neurological structure is different, and their drug of choice is different. Their family structure is different, their personality is different, and so we have to take all of those things into consideration. There may be underlying health issues, underlying mental health issues, so we have to take the whole picture into consideration when we're addressing treatment of addiction. When a family member decides that they want to help their addict, oftentimes the first compulsory response is to try to save their lives because addiction is such a fatal disease. And really the best way to help an addict is for a family member or a loved one to really educate themselves about addiction, and beyond educating themselves about addiction, to get help from them for themselves to learn how to cope with the intense emotional and psychological strain that happens when you are dealing with a loved one who's addicted. Because when you're constantly looking death in the face, it's beyond overwhelming. And death can come in many forms. You know, for an alcoholic, it could be literally drinking yourself to death, cirrhosis. It could be a car accident like a DUI. You know, we have an opiate epidemic in this country right now where people are overdosing from opiates left and right. It can come from mixing the wrong drugs. It can come from, you know, just chronic use over time and, you know, shutdown of major organ systems, heart attack, you name it, and it's real and it happens every day, all day long. And so the family members often try to get in the way of the drug addict or addict using because they want to prevent death, but they're losing track of the true full picture of recovery. So the best thing that a loved one can do to help someone get better is to educate themselves and get their own help from addiction professionals, someone who's an expert. I hope I answered that question thoroughly enough. I see a lot of action going on in the chat box, so let me just check in here. How does addiction work in our brain? That's a great question. So most people who are genetically predisposed to addiction, meaning that they're born that way. It's not just something that pops up as related to our circumstances in life. Sometimes our life circumstances can trigger what we're already genetically predisposed to, but someone who's genetically predisposed to addiction has different brain mapping. And some of the biggest differences that we can point to is that they have more of certain receptors in their brain than someone who's a non-addict does. So someone who's addicted has typically more pleasure receptors in their brain. So we now know, and I wish I had them handy, but we could show you MRI brain imaging scans of someone who's an addict that has just used cocaine and someone who's a non-addict that just used cocaine. And the scans, the images, are completely different. For the addict, you can see that the brain scan is completely lit up in a larger portion of the brain than the non-addict. It just lights up kind of the normal pleasure receptor areas. So what we know for addicts is that any kind of pleasure that they receive, which helps them numb pain, they experience on exponential levels compared to someone who's non-addicted. So that's a really, really basic synopsis of how it works in the brain, but basically, for the addict who feels that they're suffering from some sort of pain, whatever it is that they're using to numb that pain, it feels really good and it works for them, and they believe that that's their solution. The next question is, I wonder if addiction changes our brain. It absolutely changes our brain. So the longer that we act in addiction, meaning the longer that we're using either the substance or the process to numb the pain, it affects a lot of parts of the brain especially the prefrontal cortex. So that's this part right up here that's responsible for motivation, for executive functioning, like high-level decisions, and attention span. And so it starts to, as the prefrontal cortex, and it's kind of a question of chicken or the egg. Is an addict born with already a prefrontal cortex that's not functioning at the level that it could be? And then is addiction also reinforcing that the prefrontal cortex works less and less well over time? So think about an addict who needs to work so hard to overcome the pain and suffering related to giving up their drug of choice. Now their prefrontal cortex isn't functioning adequately or optimally, and so now they're lacking motivation. They're making poor decisions because that's the part of the brain that's responsible for decision making, and their attention span is short. And so these are where sometimes tools like meditation really come in handy, because meditation is known to strengthen the prefrontal cortex. So that's why sometimes those holistic approaches are really helpful for people who are recovering from addiction, because it helps improve the pathways in the brain, or the portions of the brain that get affected. So that's just one area of the brain and one way that it is affected by addiction. The next question is, what is the best way you can support someone recovering from addiction? So the best way you could support them, honestly, is love them unconditionally. And that can be one of the hardest things, because staying close to someone who's actively using, it's scary, it's overwhelming, and a lot of times you just don't know what to do. And know that addicts carry so much shame because they don't want to be addicts. And so they just carry so much shame, and there's so much stigma, and they're not really understood well by the people around them, and they're treated very differently, and treated as though there's something wrong with them, and that they're like a plague to society a lot of times. And they do make a lot of choices that are harmful for the people around them and society, so it is complex. But what they need more than anything is unconditional love and support. That doesn't mean that they need unconditional help, meaning, you don't want to always bail them out of trouble, or what we call enable them to do things for them that they could do for themselves. But sometimes they do need extra support, being pointed in the direction of, like, hey, I'll take you to a meeting, or I'll drop you off at detox, or I'll help you get connected with a treatment center that you can check yourself into. Just knowing that they're there for you, that you're willing to be there for them and support them in a recovery path, and not giving them money or helping bail them out of needing to pay their rent or that kind of thing because they've spent their money on their substances or gambling or whatever it is. So unconditional love, not unconditional help. There's a difference. And educating yourself, and again, asking for help. There are great support groups out there for addicts and for the loved ones of addicts. I personally spent a lot of years in the rooms of Al-Anon, which is a 12-step support group for the loved ones of addicts, where I learned so much about how I could manage my own stress related to having loved ones that were addicted, and I learned how best to support an addict. So if you have a loved one in your life that's addicted, I can't say enough about going to a support group of that nature. There's also Families Anonymous, Nar-Anon. There's a lot of different things out there. And then also, of course, seeing a professional who can give you some professional guidance is always a good idea. Let's see, what is the best way for the family to receive help while dealing with someone with addiction? Thank you for your question, and thank you for being here. The best way for the family to receive help is really, and I think I just touched on some of that, is to really plug into their own support group. And I can't say enough about 12-step programs. They're not the solution for everyone, and I know sometimes people think that 12-step support is all about having to become aligned with a religion or God, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. 12-step support groups have nothing to do with religion. It is literally a support group that has a structure that provides you with a group of people that have gone before you, that know how to deal with the problem. It provides you with a set of steps that you would work together with a sponsor. It supplies you with literature that you can read, with phone numbers to call when you're in crisis, with a whole program to follow. And the reason that that's so important when you're in crisis as a family member is because it's easy to get dragged into the crisis of addiction, and unless you have a strong support system in place and a program in place. And it doesn't have to be 12-step. It could be through your church, or it could be through a community program where they are familiar with addiction and how to address it. But a program really helps create a net and a process for you to know how to deal with it and to be able to kind of lean into when you don't have the strength to do it. So families really need support, and they need education, and they need to know that the choices that they're making are contributing to either the solution or the problem. So I hope I've answered your question, and I hope I've raised some awareness. A lot of times, family members come to me and they know nothing about 12-step support groups for them, and there's a stigma about attending. So many of the family members that I work with, they're terrified to talk to their friends, their peer groups, about addiction because of the stigma. They're afraid to walk into a meeting. They don't know what to say. And the reality is those are all the same fears that the addict faces. And so if we have an expectation or a desire for our addict to get better, why wouldn't we be willing to go to the same lengths to support them, to learn about what to do? And so going to an Al-Anon meeting, in my opinion, just one woman's humble opinion, is not enough just to attend a series of meetings. You have to be willing to actually work the program, which means just like you would ask an addict to do to work a program would be to get a sponsor, to work the steps, to call people for support. And a lot of times when you're struggling with addiction, whether you're the addict or you're a family member, there's depression, there's anxiety, there's all of these underlying things. And we know that reaching out and connecting with others is the antidote to depression, that isolation breeds depression. And so getting help is going to help get rid of depression, is going to help increase the chance of survival for both the family member and the addict. So let's see, the next question is, do you think the stigmas of addiction prevent people from seeking help, and how do we get around that? The stigma of addiction absolutely prevents people from seeking help. I think that the stigma of addiction promotes denial in family members, and a lot of times, and not just family members, but friends and society in general. And so because we kind of want to have blinders on and we don't want to deal with it as a society, and we don't want to deal with it in our personal lives, and it's so overwhelming that it just encourages the stigma. And then some of the behaviors that go with addiction that we hear about, like DUIs and theft and overdoses, these are scary things that we're not necessarily equipped to handle, or that we don't want around us. And so, you know, a lot of people attribute addiction to being a moral issue, like people who are addicted are, you know, they have a poor moral compass, and that's not really what's going on at all. And so I think we as a society need to completely reframe how we see addiction, and there is certainly a movement in that direction, in understanding more about how to support people who are addicts. There's a great TED Talk that's titled "Everything You Think You Know About Addiction Is Wrong." I think that's close. And it talks about the importance of an addict having purpose and value and connection. And it cites the rat park studies that were done a long time ago, where they introduced an addictive substance into a rat park, where really the rats were the studies where the studies were done, and rats that had things to do used the drugs far less or didn't use them at all, as far compared to rats who didn't have anything to do in their cages. And so we understand that the brain functions better with community, with connection, with support, and with purpose. It's the same for me and for you, so why wouldn't it be the same for someone who's addicted? We praise support groups when we're dealing with grief or cancer or diabetes or, you know, you name it. But with addiction, we're afraid of being ostracized, of being social pariahs, whether it's the person seeking recovery or the family. So I hope I've answered your question. I see another question that says, I hope that your methods are being shared by more of the professionals in your field. Do you have a vehicle to assist with this? Meaning, just to clarify, I want to make sure I understand your question. the method of family members getting treatment and using 12-step programs. My vehicle for this is kind of the platforms that I have, such as my YouTube channel, blogging. You know, when I speak with family members, I was asked to be a speaker at a 12-step support group for FA, and I very much encouraged therapy and other involvement. So I do as much as I can to spread the message. I partner with treatment centers sometimes to do some consulting about the importance of involving family members. I talk to clinical directors and treatment centers a lot of times, and I say, if you're going to send me a referral as a therapist, more than continuing care for the client, send me the parents while their loved one is in treatment, because that's where we can help make the best difference long term. Once that client gets out of treatment, we can help create that supportive environment so that the parents don't undo all the work, and that they're educated in the way that they need to be to create more long-term success. So those are some of the things that I do to promote this kind of thinking. And I know that in my therapist collective in Boca, we definitely all agree with this type of mindset, and this is definitely what we suggest. You know, one of my ahas and what brought me to Al-Anon was I realized how out of integrity I was when I was working for a really high-end, well-known treatment center, and I was referring families to Al-Anon, but I had never even been. And just as a professional working in the industry, never mind that I was in denial about the addiction that was going on in my own family, I belonged in Al-Anon. I needed help just dealing with and coping with the day in and day out of helping people who are addicted. And so treatment professionals, there's a stigma, and I just did a talk about this for some industry professionals. Treatment professionals need their own support, and a lot of times treatment professionals are the last ones to get their own help. And so yeah, this is, now you got me all fired up. This is definitely one of my one of the things that I'm passionate about, is that, you know, we can't be the blind leading the blind. We need to take responsibility for how we're contributing to the solution as professionals, as loved ones, and we need to lead by example and not just place all the responsibility on the addict to get better. Let's see, I see a question that's, can you overcome an addiction short term, or does it always take a long time? It takes a long time. And by a long time, I mean forever. and that's kind of scary and overwhelming, and that's why one of the most important slogans in a program, whether it's for Al-Anon and the families or for the addict that is working on their recovery, it's only a 24-hour program, meaning I'm only as recovered as I act, as I practice in the 24 hours that I have today. And tomorrow is a whole new day. It's not here yet, and yesterday is already gone, so I have to focus on today. And because of the neurological structure and the genetic component of addiction, it unfortunately is pretty much a lifelong diagnosis. We do know with brain science these days that we do have the ability to change genetic coding and to change brain mapping, but that takes an incredible amount of practice over time. And so one of the things we look for in recovery, whether it's with the addict or with the family, is consistency over time. The addict needs to demonstrate consistency over time in order to feel better, and the family needs to demonstrate consistency over time in order to rebuild trust, and in order for the addict to know that there is some relationship there that they can work on. Because a lot of times when an addict does start to work on recovery, the family relationships have been so destroyed, it takes time to rebuild on both parts. But a lot of times family members send mixed messages to addicts, and they send their addicts to treatment or to the rooms, and they say, you deal with it, you fix them, you get better, and it creates a huge disconnect. So it's very much a long-term process, and really a lifelong process. And a lot of times family members don't understand that, and they ask their loved ones that are addicted, well, how long do you have to go to those meetings? Or how long do you have to stay a part of your support group? Or how long do you need to be in therapy? And it really depends for each person, because again, everybody's brain and circumstances are different. But a lot of times someone needs to be plugged into some sort of support for the rest of their life, whatever level that looks like for them. Let's see. Can you overcome? Oh, no, I already answered that one. Okay. Let's see. Scrolling down here. What addiction is the hardest to quit? Well, believe it or not, I'm going to go with two that you might not expect. One is nicotine, meaning cigarette smoking. And so what we understand from the science is that nicotine and opiates work similarly with the receptors in the brain. And because smoking is so much more socially acceptable than heroin or OxyContin, and it's something that we almost facilitate for people by offering smoke breaks and it just being like still culturally and socially acceptable in so many ways. It's chemically, habitually, and socially, it's just one of the hardest addictions to kick. And then the other one would be a process addiction, two of them really, and that would be related to food and sex. And that's because when we're talking about addiction with substances, such as alcohol or nicotine or opiates, the intent is to cease your relationship with those things, to no longer interact with them. With a process addiction like food or with sex, it's about navigating a healthy relationship with them. And that takes a lot longer. You can't just quit eating. It's not healthy to just never have sex again. And so being able to move into recovery with things, process addictions like sexually related process addictions or food related process addictions, it takes longer to learn how to navigate that place where I can enjoy food or enjoy sex without it becoming a way to numb or to heal the psychological heal. I don't mean really heal, but that's the addict's perception, is that it's getting rid of the psychological, emotional, or physical pain. So there have been so many awesome questions today. I'm so grateful for those of you that tuned in. Great questions. I hope that we've done a small part in overcoming the stigma of addiction, of raising consciousness about the importance of loved ones, getting involved, becoming educated, and really shifting the way we view addiction in the world. I see one more question. I wonder what triggers a specific addiction. Well, what triggers a specific addiction is typically a combination of genetic predisposition and some set of life circumstances. So, for instance, someone who's already, we know that they're born as an addict. If they're exposed early on in their teenage years to recreational use of a substance, that then triggers the addiction. If someone's already born with the addicted brain and they're introduced to, let's say, something that happens commonly is competitive dance, especially in ballet, then all of a sudden that is an environmental trigger around food and restricting their diet, and then the addictive process gets launched that way. So any insecurities or discomfort they feel about needing to be a good enough dancer and needing to be thin enough and enough, it's about worthiness at that point. They use food as a way to control that, and then their feelings get all confused with performance and being worthy. And so there's a lot of different ways that life circumstances can trigger what's already existing for the addicted brain. And so I hope that clarified your question. So thank you so much to everyone who is here today. Amazing questions. Please, if this video has taught you anything or you feel that it's done anything to really raise consciousness or break through the stigma of addiction, please share this video with anyone that you know could benefit. You'd never know when just one person listening might say, you know what, I've been afraid to walk into a meeting and I'm going to go find one today. And anything that you can do to break that stigma will improve the quality of the life for both the addict and their loved ones. And most of us out there know someone who is struggling with addiction, and you may not even know it. But I promise you there's someone close to you in your life that is struggling with addiction, either they're as an addict or as the loved one of an addict. And you can do your part by being an open and willing participant in that conversation and providing unconditional love and support. So thank you so much for joining me. If this has been helpful, give it a thumbs up, subscribe to my channel so that you can hear more about sensitive topics, important topics like these. And like I said, please share this video if it's been helpful to anyone in your life. Thank you so much. Have a great day.